Okay, Savannah.
Good morning, everyone. Bienvenidos and welcome to the first Pave the Way session of 2021. Thank you to the State Board for Community and Technical Colleges, Futures Northwest, and the Washington Student Association for working with the Washington Student Achievement Council on this webinar. My name is Savannah Navarro-Cressy, and today we will first explore the data to answer whether Washington is achieving equity in post-secondary education. Following the data presentation, we will hear from our moderator, Dr. Christopher Nellam, Deputy Director of Research and Policy at Education Trust, to offer a perspective on this issue nationally. And we will hear from several students to offer their perspective in reflecting not only on the data, but the realities and lived experience of navigating post-secondary pathways. Before we get started, we would like to do a land acknowledgement, and I would like to introduce Ashley France, who will be guiding us through this. Ashley France graduated from Port Angeles High School and is now a sophomore attending Peninsula College. Ashley will graduate in the spring of 2021 and plans on transferring to another school. She is in her second year of being a team captain for the Peninsula College eSport program. And she currently holds a work-study position as an office assistant for the Acoustonaut House of Learning at the Peninsula College Longhouse. Ashley?
Hello, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the land that I'm on here in Port Angeles. I am on the indigenous lands of Musqueam Territory. The indigenous peoples of the Klallam, Makah, Quileute, and the Hoh tribes reserve this treaty rights to this land and this territory. We thank the caretakers of this land who have lived and continue to live here since time immemorial. At this time, we'd like to have you open the link in the chat and view the interactive map to see what native territory you reside on and enter it in the chat.
Thank you, Ashley, and to everyone joining us in this land acknowledgement. And I'm looking forward to reading all of your chats as we continue on. Next slide. Before we begin our session today, I'd like to acknowledge the historic events that have taken place over the last 24 hours. The violent and seditious riots that took place in our nations and state capitals yesterday are not only an appalling display of disrespect for America's system of democracy, but they also are a clear symptom of the current president's long-standing display of racism, hatred, division, deceit, abuse of power, and more. The Washington Student Achievement Council stands against this divisive and hateful behavior, and we'd like to share this statement from the leaders of Washington's higher education system. As leaders of public and private not-for-profit colleges and universities in the state of Washington, we stand strongly together in denouncing today's attack on the U.S. Capitol and on democracy. Since the earliest days of this nation, higher education has prepared an engaged, informed, and civic-minded citizenry. In this way, our shared mission is fundamental to democracy and is in sharp contrast to the shocking scene that unfolded in Washington, D.C. Collectively, we redouble our commitment to preparing our students and future generations to help ensure that our democracy continues to thrive. Thank you to our higher education leaders for this statement, and I will go ahead and pass it off to Heather Hudson.
Thank you, Savannah. And thank you all for joining us today in our first Pave the Way session of 2021. A few housekeeping items. We will be using the chat function. So if you have questions throughout the session today, please chat those in. We will be monitoring those for portion dedicated to question and answer later. And you can also use the thumbs up feature if you're interested in a question somebody has already posed. This session is an hour and a half, will be recorded and posted on our website following the session. I want to spend just a brief moment making sure folks understand who the Washington Student Achievement Council is. We are a state agency that provides state policy, planning, and research to increase post-secondary attainment. We administer the state financial aid program, Washington College Grant, College Bound Scholarship, and many others. We also administer college saving plans, as well as a few college and career readiness programs. And lastly, we are here to advocate on behalf of our students to ensure that students can access, enroll, and complete a post-secondary education. Next slide. We are also, as I mentioned, we are a state agency, and we also have a 9-member council. This slide shows our governor-appointed council members that includes students, leaders from K-12 and higher education sectors, as well as our executive director, Michael Miotti. Next slide. As I mentioned, Washington Student Achievement Council is focused on increasing post-secondary attainment. This slide shows our strategic framework with equity at the center. We are prioritizing racial equity as a necessary part of our goal to increase student post-secondary attainment to 70%, especially because for Washington residents who are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander, regardless of immigration status, only 50% or less currently have a post-secondary credential. As a council, we recognize the historic and current institutional and structural racism in Washington state and in our country, and acknowledge our complicity in maintaining this reality by upholding policies, processes, and practices that have created barriers on the path to this goal for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander students. Our council has recently adopted an equity statement that is up on our website if you'd like to learn more. This Pave the Way session will talk about racial equity, and we'll focus on hearing from our students around ways that we can increase post-secondary attainment, and looking at these 4 areas: increasing and maintaining affordability, ensuring enrollment increases, ensuring students can complete, and that students have access to the basic needs to ensure that they can earn that credential. So with that, I will hand it off to our presenters to share some data that comes from a recent report that WASAC released. And so I will hand it off to Emma and Sarah.
Thanks so much, Heather and Savannah, for putting this together. So when we're looking at social issues, including education, we know that it's important to allow the data to highlight where equity gaps exist and to use data and research to determine the best solutions to address inequities. This presentation, like Heather mentioned, is based on research and findings presented in our recent Equity Landscape report, which provides more detail around equity and education in Washington. And I think Savannah or Heather, someone's going to go ahead and put that in the chat for you to reference. So we want to start by framing educational outcomes not only as an equity concern, but also as an economic one. We know that higher education has a lot of benefits for individuals. For instance, we know that those with higher levels of education earn more than those with less education. Figure 1 shows a very clear pattern that higher education leads to higher earnings. We also know that there's a persistent racial wealth gap in the United States. Figure 2 shows that the wealth gap between typical Black and white families has not changed much in the last few decades. In 1989 and 2016, a typical Black household had a net worth less than 1/10 of a typical white household. Historically, we know that more education also leads to a lower likelihood of being unemployed. And the COVID-19 crisis has further exacerbated this issue. Figure 3 on the slide shows that those with higher education were less likely to be unemployed in October 2020 than those without higher education. We also know that there are racial disparities in unemployment. For instance, the unemployment rate in October 2020 in Washington state was almost 13% for American Indian people and almost 9% for Black people, but just 5% for white people in the state. Of course, earnings and employment are not the only benefits of higher education. Research also shows that higher education leads to better health, higher civic engagement levels, and more trust in others. Next slide. So because of these benefits of higher education, along with the growing labor market demand for people with post-secondary credentials, Washington has a statewide education attainment goal that 70% of young adults ages 25 to 44 will have a post-secondary credential. However, when we look at the attainment broken down by racial group, we see large differences in current attainment levels. The graph shown here on the left shows the proportion of each racial group ages 25 to 44 with at least an associate's degree. Some groups are even further from the statewide attainment goal than others, as seen from the distance between the blue bar and the black horizontal line that represents the state goal. The largest gap between current attainment and the statewide goal occur for American Indian, Hispanic, and Native Hawaiian people in the state. And to put this in context, the Hispanic population is the second largest racial group in the state. As you can see, there's more detail about educational attainment by race in the graph on the right, which shows educational attainment for each racial group broken down by attainment level. The red boxes highlight those with a high school education or less, and the blue boxes show the proportion with associate's degrees and higher. So with these attainment outcomes in mind, we're going to briefly look at different measures along the educational pipeline to see where racial disparities exist. We'll look at some of the disparities in post-secondary enrollment, persistence, and completion in the upcoming slides. Next slide. So to start us off, we know that there are differences in post-secondary enrollment by race. The chart here shows the percentage of students who graduated from public high schools in Washington in 2018 who enrolled in post-secondary programs within 1 year of high school graduation. The chart shows the proportion of students of each race who went to 2-year institutions in orange and who went to 4-year institutions in blue. The groups with the lowest overall immediate post-secondary enrollment rates are Native Hawaiian, American Indian, and Hispanic students. And additionally, only about 1 in 5 Native Hawaiian, American Indian, and Hispanic students enrolled at 4-year institutions within 1 year of high school graduation. That's compared to 37% of white students and 56% of Asian students. Next slide. The table on this slide shows the racial demographic makeup for public high schools and also public 2-year and 4-year institutions in Washington. We can see that there are differences in the racial distributions of each. I want to specifically point out our Hispanic students, who make up about 1/4 of the public high school population, but only about 1/10 of our public higher ed population in the state. This shows that we're already seeing underrepresentation of Hispanic students on college campuses compared to the high school population in the state. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Sarah, to talk about persistence and completion.
Thanks, Emma. Disparities by race go beyond post-secondary enrollment. We also see differences in outcomes for some students once they are already already enrolled in higher education. The graph on this slide shows persistence rates for students who graduated from public high schools in Washington in 2018. It displays persistence rates by racial groups at 2-year and 4-year institutions, in blue and orange respectively. Across the board, persistence rates are lower at 2-year institutions than 4-year institutions. But we also see that some students of color experience lower persistence rates at both types of institutions. For example, at both 2-year and 4-year institutions, persistence rates are the lowest for Native Hawaiian and American Indian students. Next slide. Some students initially enroll at 2-year institutions as a pathway to getting a 4-year degree. However, only about 22% of students who intend to transfer actually do 2 years later. and some groups have even lower transfer rates than others. The graph on the right shows the successful transfer rate of students at public two-year institutions in Washington by race. It shows the proportion of public two-year students in Washington who indicated an intent to transfer, who were enrolled in a public four-year institution 2 years later. Successful transfer rates are lowest for Black and American Indian students. Next slide. There are also considerable disparities in graduation rates for different racial groups. Graduation rates for two-year institutions are shown in orange on the graph, and graduation rates for four-year institutions are shown in blue. In general, graduation rates are much lower at two-year institutions than four-year institutions. Only about 1 in 5 Black and American Indian students graduated from two-year institutions within 3 years. And only 38% of American Indian students and 53% of Black students graduated from four-year institutions within 6 years. Next slide. We want to conclude by saying that it's important to allow the data to identify racial equity issues, and this analysis helps us do that. However, the data does not tell us why we continue to see racial disparities in education. There are some limitations with the data. We have presented the information on racial groups based on how the data was collected, but this data does not allow for further disaggregation within those racial groups. And because it's aggregate data, we can't perform further analysis around intersectionalities of race with other characteristics like income, immigration status, and gender. But the racial equity gaps that we have shown throughout this presentation for different outcomes along our education pathway is still important evidence for policymakers to engage in conversations around what needs to be done to close racial equity gaps. So now that we've explored some of these gaps, we will pass it back to Heather.
Thank you, Sarah and Emma. Before we move on, I don't know, Savannah, are there any questions specific around the data that have come through the Q&A that you could read or share with Sarah or Emma?
There is one in the chat, and that was before I had asked attendees to put questions in the Q&A. And the question is the transfer rate you're highlighted only at the 2-year mark, or do we see a higher rate of transfer past 2 years?
I can take that one. So, and actually, Crystal, if you want to go back to that slide. One more, I think. Yeah, right there. So the data that we present here, Sarah mentioned, but it is a little bit tricky. This shows students at public 2-year institutions in Washington who indicated that they intended to transfer, who actually showed up enrolled at a public 4-year institution 2 years later, just to clarify. So it's definitely possible and probably likely that if we were to look 4 years later, 3 years later, 6 years later, we might see more of those students showing up.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you.
There is an additional question that asks, are there any comparisons across time for these measures? Has persistence rates, for example, improved for different groups? Have there been so many efforts over the years in high schools and on college campuses? Have they made detectable differences?
That's a great question. So the data that we are reporting in the Equity Landscape Report looks at a point in time to sort of snapshot what's happening right now in public institutions in Washington. So I'm not going to answer that historical question, but it is a good one, and it's definitely something worth looking into. And feel free to go ahead and shoot Sarah an email. I'm sure our contact information will be shared, and we can try to look into that.
The last question that we'll take from here live, the other questions we can answer, but this one will be the last live one. Are undocumented students reflected in the data?
It depends on the data. So we used a lot of different data sources for this report. Definitely undocumented students are included in some of that. And I'm trying to think of cases where undocumented students might be left out. And the answer is I'm not actually totally sure, because we're using aggregate data. We don't have the sort of the data broken down that way that we can see for different groups of students. But it is a really important question, something that should be explored further.
Thank you. In order to keep us moving and get on to our students, I'm gonna thank you, Emma and Sarah, and please, for all the attendees, please feel free to keep chatting in your questions. I think maybe we can retain Emma or Sarah for the portion, but if we can't, we can definitely forward your questions to them by email and try and get back to you. So I just wanted to kind of frame the conversation before I hand it off to our moderator. Kind of the thinking on this session, as you've seen, is focused on looking at racial equity gaps within post-secondary education. And we wanted to offer Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings' term that she's coined, education debt, as a way to describe the cumulative impact of fewer resources and other harm directed at students of color. Dr. Ladson-Billings and others have argued that state policymakers should rethink the term equity gap and consider a framing of educational debt. This context and reframing takes into account the history of our country shaped by institutionalized racism and ensures that the onus of the gap is put on the state and not on the student. To expand on this concept and get the conversation going, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Nellam. Chris, if you can go to the next slide. Dr. Chris Nellam is the Deputy Director of Research and Policy at Education Trust, a civil rights and education equity research and advocacy organization working on educational justice to close attainment and opportunity gaps. Chris is a gubernatorial appointee to the Student-Centered Funding Formula Oversight Committee, charged with reviewing and evaluating the implementation of the community college system's new funding formula in California. He began his career on college campuses in student affairs and has been a higher education researcher and advocate for nearly a decade. Chris was raised in the Imperial Valley, defied the odds after experiencing rural poverty to become a first-generation college student and graduate. An alumna of 3 public universities, he is committed to guaranteeing that the doors to an affordable quality public education are wide open for the next generations of Californians, especially low-income students of color. Dr. Nellam, we're thrilled to have you here today, and we'll hand it off to you for some remarks and to facilitate our conversation with students.
Awesome, thank you, Heather, and good morning, everyone. Give me just 1 second while I figure out this technology. You would think I would have this down by now, but I do not. All right, can you all see the normal view for that? Awesome. Sorry, I'm moving stuff out of the way. All right, so yes, good morning. It's good to be here with all of you. I will admit it's a little challenging to try and function business as usual after what happened yesterday. No matter what you think about it, it was quite a day yesterday. And for me, it was quite the day because I worked in DC for several years, and so I've walked those halls, and I have friends who are still in DC and were in the building yesterday. One of whom who works for a chair of one of the major education committees and was, for her safety, dragged from her office and put in one of the tunnels under the building to get out. And so I share that just to say that's weighing heavily on my heart and my mind this morning. And I hope that I don't, that I make Heather and Savannah proud, even though my mind is certainly distracted. So again, my name is Chris Nellam. I am the Deputy Director at the Education Trust West. I'll share more about the organization in a second. But did want to just remind folks or invite you to just take a breath. There's lots going on in the world. I had this slide in here even before yesterday. because 2020, as we know, was a doozy. So yeah, just take a breath, take a moment to hopefully try and be in the virtual room that we're in together. I'll share a little bit more on the next slide about at Trust West. I'm not sure what folks know about the Education Trust, but we are a nonprofit educational equity research and advocacy organization. We were founded 30 years ago in Washington, D.C., and 20 years ago in the state of California. We really came to be because our founder was frustrated with the lack of representation among advocates for low-income students of color. I think she was seen in Washington, D.C. at the time that there were lots of folks in the Capitol who advocate for middle-income and white communities, but not a lot of folks who spend their time in a full-time way advocating for low-income students of color. And as we know, if your voices are not heard, then you're often not reflected in policy, and then of course in the practices that come from those policies. So it's a little quick snippet about the Education Trust. At Trust West is, despite our name, we focus on California in a full-time way. The organization, the Education Trust more broadly, actually, since this is a Washington group, is starting to be represented in Washington state. And so we're doing some hiring and building out of a coalition there. And I'm happy to share more about that if folks are interested. The next slide is just a little bit about me, because I think it's important to understand who's standing in front of you or sitting in front of you, even in a virtual sense. This is a baby picture of me that our former communications director found online somehow, which is a little freaky, but that is certainly me. Born to a single mother, clearly I'm Black, so a single Black mother. I'm from a town called Brawley, California. It's a border town. Population was less than that when I lived there, but real small town. We have the highest poverty rate in California. We're a border town, high agricultural activity. Brawley High School, then I went to college, thankfully at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Grad school part 1 at California State University, Long Beach. Then I made the terrible decision to leave California and went to the Midwest where it snows. So I spent 6 long winters in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I did my PhD. And then after that, as Heather mentioned, I've spent over 10 years doing advocacy work. I was in DC for, as I mentioned, working on the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, for many years, and spent some good time working across the aisle to keep the Affordable Care Act alive. And then since then have found my way back to California, and I've been at Trust West for a few years now. And we spend our time, as I mentioned, making sure that policies reflect the needs of students of color, and more importantly, and more specifically, poor students of color, because they're often not represented in rooms when policy is made. And so really what I want to spend some time, hopefully I can zoom through this so we can get to the students, which is the most important part of our day to day, but just 3 questions for you all as we move forward. One is just, what does equity mean to you? I usually ask folks to write this down on a piece of paper, but really just to take a second. Equity is in the title of today's event, and that word is thrown around quite a bit. And so I often find it useful to give people an opportunity to think about it. What does it mean to you? What doesn't it mean to you? And then just a little bit about what it means to me and at Trust West, if it's helpful. I think about equity primarily through a racial equity lens. So I think about racial equity. And when I think about our mission at the Education Trust is to achieve equity, achieve racial equity. And so for us, that comes in at least 2 parts. Recognizing that there are some historic, I would argue also contemporary, disparities, both in opportunities and outcomes, which we'll talk a little more about in a few seconds. But also another part of achieving equity from our perspective, and of course this may differ from your perspective, but I think it's important to understand at least where I'm coming from. The second part is that there needs to be a allocation of resources that can address those disparities and dismantle those barriers. Our ultimate goal at the Education Trust West is to remove those barriers completely. But in the meantime, what we're trying to do is drive additional resources to places where we know there are really high concentrations of folks of color, communities of color. So that's how we think about racial equity and equity in a nutshell. Happy to talk some more about that if folks have questions or comments. But my next question is, how do we make sense of, or how might we make sense of the data that was shared earlier, that I believe Emma and Sarah shared earlier. And I worked on college campuses. I work with lots of higher ed folks now. And sorry, I have screens all over the place. Apologies. And I think it's easy to look at those data, especially the racial equity data that Emma and Sarah shared, and say, some version of, well, those students just don't belong. They don't belong. Or I've heard from folks, good folk, well-intentioned folks, or those students just don't try hard enough. I've also heard, particularly from our more elite, quote unquote, elite institutions in California, most of the University of California. I imagine the University of Washington is probably the similar type of institution in the state of Washington. We sometimes hear, well, those students should go somewhere else first and then come to us. And somewhere else is usually community college, where my first job was at a community college, or folks will say they should go to work and then come back to us when they're quote unquote ready. And then we wouldn't see those sorts of disparities that Emma and Sarah walked us through. My favorite of the responses is, again, well-intentioned folks, hardworking folks saying things like, well, it's not me. It's not our institution, it's us. I mean, it's not me. It's them. It's not us, it's them. It's not higher ed, it's them. And so, I'd bet my right foot that that narrative was running through someone's mind when Emma and Sarah were reviewing those statistics. And I don't say that to shame anyone, but instead to invite you to suspend that thinking if you can, and just think differently about investment in places and spaces where there are people who have been marginalized or people of color, because it's not necessarily about individual effort or desire. And I'm just hopefully share a very quick example from California. I circled it here on this slide to hopefully drive this point home. So in California, we see that there are disparities, I think, in similar disparities, at least trend-wise, around college going to our four-year institutions. You see fewer students of color who attend our four-year colleges and universities in the state. And again, folks' narratives, they can run narratives through their mind that would suggest they don't, students of color don't want to go to four-year colleges. They're not, cut out to go to four-year colleges. They are less interested in our colleges. And I share this example because I don't believe that to be true. And again, I think we should suspend that sort of thinking and think about investment, historical investment in these communities. And so you'll see very quick and dirty about California, and I don't know what it's like in Washington State, but in order to be eligible to go to a four-year college or university in the state of California, you have to complete a college preparatory sequence called the A through G sequence. But in schools where there are more students of color, sometimes that entire sequence is not offered. You see here that in schools where there's higher poverty, which we know poverty is correlated with race, so we can assume that there's also more students of color in these places. Not all of the classes at the schools that these kids are at are even qualified. They're not even eligible courses to go to the four-year college and university. So I share this because no matter how hard those students try, no matter how much they want to go to a four-year college or university, by no fault of their own, they're in a high school that doesn't offer all of the classes they need to be able to go to college. And to me, that is not about individual effort. That's about investment. Choices. We have made choices in the state of California to underinvest in those schools and to, almost by definition, keep students of color from being eligible to go to our four-year colleges. So you can graduate from college, just to make that point hopefully clear, you can graduate from high school in the state of California and still not be eligible to go to college because your high school did not offer the very courses that you need to be eligible to go to college. And just to drive that point even further, we know that happens in our state more often than not in places where there are higher concentration of brown and Black people. That to me is a set of issues that we need to think about and interrogate as we think about educational debt, as we think about why these gaps exist, as we think about what we want to call these gaps. I would actually not even call them racial equity gaps. They're actually opportunity gaps. These young folks didn't have the opportunity even to think about going to college because a public high school didn't offer the courses. So I hope that's helpful as folks think about how to make sense of those data. My second question, or the third question is, why even listen to students? And I'm sure that I bet my left foot, hopefully I still have it, my right foot, that someone in this room is asking that question or has asked the question in the past. And I think, again, good people can ask that sort of question because you show up every day and do this work. You're an expert. How can a student know better than you? And again, I just ask folks to suspend that sort of thinking because history and evidence have shown us that students, like the folks on this panel today, have led or created or been at the forefront of some of the most important movements in the United States of America. So I just want to give folks some examples of those. Just if you're not convinced yet, hopefully you are because you're here, but if you're not convinced yet about why we should listen to students, one, it's the right thing to do. We're here to serve them, I would argue. But the other is, again, they have pushed us, they have pushed America to think differently about lots of stuff. So these are young people in the 1960s. These were students, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, at a lunch counter in the 1960s. And these young people helped launch the civil rights movement, a movement that changed the face of the US. And these were students. These are the students who were part of the Third World Liberation Front at San Francisco State University and the University of California, Berkeley, also in the 1960s, who wanted more ethnic studies, or they wanted ethnic studies representation in their colleges. They pushed for things they wanted to see. And there were folks at always pushed us to think differently. These are young people at UC Berkeley protesting for our undocumented students and community. This was long before DACA existed. And so these folks were pushing us to think differently. These are young folks at Howard University, students in DC, a historically Black university, who went on a hunger strike and forced the university to think differently about how they served Black students at Howard. And so I offer that just as a reminder that it's important to listen. These folks, students have always pushed us to think differently, to be better. And I know it's easy, I've done it myself in the past, to say, well, what do they know? I know best. And as we transition to the panel, so I think we're gonna need to get back to the other slides in a second. Just again, remember to breathe. Lots is going on in the world. And I'm happy to answer questions or be in touch after today. But I hope those three sort of grounding questions are important or are helpful to you as we, sorry, Savannah, I just saw your message, as we transition. So now I think we're gonna get back to the slides. Is that right, Savannah?
Yes, Crystal, if you want to, or actually, I don't think there's any more slides. We'll go ahead and leave slides off for now so that we could interact with the students and pay attention closely to this conversation.
Fantastic. So again, hopefully those framing comments were helpful. I hope it was also inspiring and motivating for our students on the panel. We're hoping that today's conversation is a conversation. And I want to, if folks can wave as I introduce you, although I guess your names are on the screen too, but first I want to introduce Deanna George, who's a student at Tacoma Community College. Good morning, Deanna. Thanks for being with us. Next, I want to introduce screen business today. Goodness, apologies. Introduce Cynthia Cruz, who is a student at Western Washington University. I can't see Cynthia, but I hope they're waving. There you are. Next is Ashley France of Peninsula College. Hi, Ashley. Thanks for being with us. Our next student panelist is Natasha Lewis, also at Peninsula College. Hi, Natasha. Our next student, I just saw them pop up on my screen is Mustafa Samate at the University of Washington, Seattle, I think that says. Screen challenges. And then our last but not least is Damia Birdsong at Wadcombe Community College. Hi, Damia. Fantastic. So we're excited for you all to have a conversation today. I hope that it feels that way to you all. I'm trying to get these screens together. And our first question, and I think it's an important one for folks in the room with us, is how do each of you identify? What sort of makes you you? Anyone can feel free to get started. Or should I call on someone? Are we just getting warm up? How about I call on Natasha? Natasha, how do you identify? And
hi, first I would like to say good morning, everyone. My name is Natasha Lewis, and I'm glad that everyone is in attendance today. How do I identify? Well, first, I'd like to say that I identify first off as a student. I am in pursuit of knowledge so that I can break the generational chains that are upon my family. I am a first generation, low income student, and I'm super proud of that because that makes me a pioneer for my family. The first to get higher education. And also I'd like to say that although I am categorized as African American, I'm proud to say that I've found out like what part of Africa that I'm from. And it's sad that most African Americans in this country don't know their culture, don't know their heritage, don't know their values and their songs and their traditions. So being privy to find out that information kind of helped me to kind of put into perspective who I am. I'm a person that have a zeal for activism. That's one of the things that I enjoy doing. One of my favorite activists is James Baldwin, and James Baldwin speaks to me because he did not know where his place was in the revolution. He didn't know where he fit in until he saw someone being mistreated on the news. And then he found his calling. And his calling was to protest via literature, via essays, via plays, telling stories, hearing stories. And so that's where I'm at today as far as my activism. I like to use my activism by way of literature, by way of essay and playwrights and poetry, to be able to tell my story as an individual.
thank you, Natasha. Anyone else want to share how you identify, and folks in the room? I know there was lots of good reflections when we met on Monday, and so would love for you to share with folks, but also Mustafa, I see you came unmuted.
I could go ahead. Good
Awesome.
morning.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so grateful to be here, to be part of the students who will be talking about our experiences today. And I just wanted to share a little bit about myself. Also identify first and foremost. As a student, I'm originally from Gambia, West Africa. I came to the US in 2016. So I'm an immigrant. I also went to community college, a community college graduate. Now I'm a student at the University of Washington. So that's just my umbrella identity as a student. But as a student of color as well, I have been fortunate to be involved in different roles as a student leader, making sure that I am able to sit on platforms and tables that a lot of my peers don't have the opportunity to sit, to make sure that I'm able to represent the perspectives that students of color bring to the table, making sure that folks understand where we come from, who we are, and how to respect our values, and making sure that we have that conversation and closing the opportunity gap that we currently face. Because as not only a student of color, but I come from a different place. I come from a country whereby we don't have access to basic education. But folks in from where I come from, folks have little resources to make things work for ourselves. And that is one of the reasons why I'm here today. So the United States is not comparable to where I am from. So we have a lot of resources here. So to me, excuses sometimes are not the main reason to not provide resources or opportunities for students, because I come from a place whereby we have very little resources to create things for students. So being here and seeing people dedicated and students themselves wanting to get the work done, it's all part of the identity and what we are passionate about, and why we are here today, just to speak on our perspectives and how we can collaborate with the state and agencies to create opportunities and resources for students in higher education, especially for students of color.
Thank you, Mustafa. I'm gonna move us along, but I think as folks respond to this next question, please also feel free to share how you identify before you respond, and hopefully that we can get the juices flowing. But a question, the next question, and again, hopefully you can, as you respond to, each of you respond to this, please also feel free to share how you identify. Just to repeat, I wanted to reemphasize that. The question that I'm sure is on everyone's minds is, can you share with folks how COVID has impacted your educational experiences, and share with folks in the room today sort of what that has meant for your experiences, and perhaps maybe what they might want to do differently given what you've experienced. So how has COVID impacted your educational experience? Deanna,
well,
yeah, thank you.
I am Deanna George, and I identify myself, I am as a Christian. I am a Black woman. I am a mother, and I'm a wife, and I'm a student. And those things are all important to me because my religious faith is definitely something that has been central to my family as African American for a number, many years. It also informs my sense of justice. So I just like to just say that that's how I identify in being a mother of an African American son. It definitely, that informs how I view our educational system. It helps me push beyond the norm, what we see, and to push for more and more opportunities, because I would, like to see that for others. I would say that COVID has impacted me as a student in a number of ways. It has had positive impact in some ways. For example, honestly, it has saved me time from having to travel to school, then finding a parking spot and making my way to classes. And it's been unbelievable, to be honest, how just how much time it has saved me. I've been able to, bounce back and forth between classes. It gives me more time to study. I would say that it has also been a challenge because I do really, I thrive off of the in-person experience and being able to talk to my instructor and things like that. So it's been a challenge because not every class offers live lectures. So that has been a disadvantage for me.
Thanks so much for sharing. Cynthia, Ashley, Damia, anyone want to share?
I'll go. How I identify. I always have trouble with this question because I don't know how I identify. The world would like to identify me as Black and a handful of other things. But for me, I do not identify as much because if I do allow society to identify me as what they would like to, then I will be lost because we are constantly told or shown that we are not appreciated and we are not wanted in spaces, and that we always have to second guess if we are affirmative actions. Are we just another color? Are we making the company look good? Are we actually wanted in spaces? For me, my my last name has a lot of power for me because that's where I root. And because of that, I lean on my family and my friends to identify me. So I'm a bridge builder, I'm a community builder. I'm a leader as much as possible. Um, and I'm just everlasting changing. I'm always changing. I always want to be influenced by anything and everything. Um, and for COVID, I it has been a wild experience, honestly. It's been good in some areas, but other areas where my school does not allow, it's not a mandatory for you to have Zoom meetings. So we most likely do discussion boards to be interactive with each other. And for that, I do a lot of um, topics that are very hard to talk about in a school environment most times. And I for me, it is hard to be really expressive because I don't have that face-to-face interaction with people. They don't see me, they don't see my color, they don't see the passion that I have when I talk about things. And so my voice is kind of censored and is lowered when you do have to do discussion boards and you have to find different alternatives to get your voice out, to get your message out. And so that is really a downside of being in COVID. Um, but upper side is that, you get to see your challenge. I've seen how life can really challenge me a little bit and how I will respond to that, and my resilience and my family's resilience. So it's inspiring in a way as well. Uh, and to just see how much you can handle. What is your breaking point? And really self care. That's the most important thing I've gotten out of being here in COVID, is taking care of your mentality and your physical health, and really just being able to continue to live in a world where we are broken into pieces and we are always trying to find connections to each other. So that is my little piece.
Yes, thank you, Tamia, so much. I feel lots of what you shared. Others in the chat, others are too. So thank you so much. Cynthia, Ashley, either of you want to share?
Yeah, I can go real quick. So hi everyone, I'm Cynthia. And first and foremost, how I always identify myself is as a first generation low income student. That's really where my passion lies, is working with other first generation students. So I always like to make that a point. I am also a mentor to students. I am an intern with Futures Northwest. I'm an advocate for resources for students and all things like that. And in regards to COVID and how I've been coping and what's been my biggest struggle, I would say has just been accommodations. I'm a student who goes through the Disability Access Center here at Western. So I get accommodations when it comes to testing or reading material. And that's just been the biggest thing because the DAC here gets really busy, especially in the beginning of the year and the end of the year. And that has been really hard to even complete simple assignments because I don't have my materials transcribed for me on time. And I think the next thing that some of you guys touched on was just being in person and having that discussion aspect of class. My classes are very heavy on discussion, so not having that aspect, I feel like I'm not understanding the concepts and the context of everything that I'm learning in class. So to me, when professors and universities say that it's still the same type of learning experience, I just don't agree with that. Just because I'm here, I'm struggling to be online, and I see my peers struggle as well, and it's not the same learning experience. So I just wanted to make that a point as well.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, there are lots of folks, Cynthia, who have tried, as I mentioned earlier, trying to continue with business as usual, and things are not the same. And so we certainly need to be thoughtful about what we expect of folks during this time, in particular students right now. Ashley, anything from you want to share?
Yeah.
Awesome.
So first off, with my identity, I identify as a Macaw woman. I'm an ally, an activist, a gamer, a student, and I am really proud of my work with Acoustic Out, the Longhouse at Peninsula College. I get to provide a student perspective of what we can do to make our school more equitable, and I'm really community centered, and so it's great to feel like I have an impact with that. And I would say for COVID impacting my learning, I have been struggling a lot with the lack of routine and schedule, because most of my classes I've taken online don't have synchronous Zoom sessions. And so I don't have that classroom feeling or those one-on-one moments where a teacher can kind of give you that extra help that you need. And it just doesn't feel the same online, for sure.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you. We're going to pivot a little bit. And again, I hope that you all will maybe even talk to each other a little bit for this next question and even the questions after. But just curious, Emma and Sarah shared a snippet of the data from the equity scan that they did in Washington. So they talked about, as a reminder, data around attainment. How many people in Washington State have a higher education or post-secondary credential? They shared some data disaggregated by race and ethnicity. They talked about persistence. So how many students, once they come into higher education, stay? How many of them are retained by higher education? They talked about transfer and completion. And the through thread for me was that there's lots of good things happening in Washington State, but some racial equity gaps that they highlighted. So the question for you all is, what are your reactions to those data, given who you are, given where you are as a student? What sort of reactions do you have to that type of data? I think Natasha's going to get us started, it looks like.
In the words of James Baldwin, this innocent country set us in the ghetto and expected for us to fail. With that being said, the statistics and the data makes complete sense to me. Of course, it's disheartening, to see that students who look like me are underrepresented in community colleges and also four-year universities. And I'd like to say that, I try to be optimistic in everything that I do, with everything that I view. And I'd like to say that, hopefully those numbers are going to increase real soon with programs out there like Chris's program and then the Upward Bound program. It's programs that catch students early in high school will be essential to increasing those numbers. Right now, I'm the Upward Bound manager as well for Peninsula College, and we assist low-income first-generation students to succeed. Our job as well is to try to remove any barriers in education that will prevent them from being successful. So with the work that we're doing and, the audience here, I hope that those numbers will increase and will increase soon. One of the things that I'd like to say, especially for, high school students, one of the barriers and why the numbers look the way they do is the processes at DSHS. Just to tell you a little story, it seems that people relate to stories. I'm a non-traditional student. I waited 20 plus years before I went back to school to get my education because in my household, I was raised to get married, to find a good man, get married. The rhetoric in my household wasn't you needed to go to college. So I had no idea that there were programs out there for me to become successful and for me to get to college, like Running Start. I didn't know anything about Running Start until I started to work in education. That was the first I heard of Running Start. So, basically going back to the DSHS issues, first of all, they treat people like animals there. Low income students or people of color, they're being treated like they're second-class citizens. So what do you think that, how that affects their confidence and their will and their drive when the people that are supposed to be helping them treat them like they're second class? So then they start to believe that they're second class citizens. And that shows up in the numbers, in the numbers towards education. Basically, the DSHS program have a uniform approach. They want everyone to follow this said guideline. And I'm speaking as an experience because when I came to Washington State, I had to get on assistance. Because I'm a non-traditional student, I've had experience in jobs. I know how to create a resume and all of those things, but they wanted me to go through those steps in order to receive assistance. Although I was able to do those things already when asking for assistance. They have this uniform approach instead of a catered pathway for each case. Also, when you want to go to school, though, I had to actually fight to go to school with DSHS. They's like, nope, I want you to go and look for jobs for 40 hours a week. I want you to go and attend these classes. And I'm like, no, you're not going to dictate my life. Just because I'm asking you for help doesn't give you control over my life. I want to go to school. So I got that and had to go jump through a lot of barriers to even get into the admission process. And then once I got into the admission process, they told me what degree I could take. I could not go for the AAS, which is what I wanted to do. My ultimate goal back then was to be a psychologist. So I wanted to go into Associates of Science, but DSHS told me that I could not, that I had to choose a Prof Tech program. So what I did was I chose a Prof Tech program, but I found a loophole. I chose the one that gave me an associate's degree. So I went with the district in studies and chose that. And then when I decided to get my bachelor's degree, they told me that I could no longer be on assistance because the program only allotted me a Prof Tech program and that I could either have to choose to go to school or I can choose to be on assistance and receive the food stamps and receive the TANF. So what I did was I chose to go to school. And because of my zeal and because of advocates out there, because of people who said enough is enough, because of people who said these policies are designed for students of color to fail, because of those people who stood up for me, I was able to be promoted in my job so that I was able to take care of my family and not have to rely on assistance. And I just graduated with my bachelor's degree, and I'm now enrolled in WGU for the Master's in Management and Leadership. But it wasn't because I did not have motivation to go to school that I succeeded. It wasn't because that I had this zeal for education, because I believe anyone who's in pursuit of education has that motivation, have that zeal, but then life happens. And if there's no one there to intervene, if there's no one there to support and to even just say, hey, keep your head up, you've got this. or no matter what, no matter what it is that they go through, or even say, hey, here are resources that could help you onto your journey. If I did not have those people that did that for me, that provided me with resources, if I didn't have those people who said, Natasha, I know it's hard, but you can do it. If I didn't have those people who were there to educate me and to help me navigate the educational system, I would not be in the statistics, in those numbers that says African-American person succeeded. I would be in the number where, another dropout, another person failing to meet their goals. So I said all of that to say this. It just seems like the DHS program and other barriers are intentionally designed to keep low income and first generation citizens down. And I'm here today to tell you that equity is going to be the vehicle that success is going to ride out on. Having that equity and having all institutions foster a culture of equity is going to help those numbers to increase. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Natasha. There's so much richness there, but two things that jump out at me is early in your comments you said, what I took away is that the systems that are in place are set up to get the very results that we're seeing. They're doing very perfectly what they were designed to do, which I'm sure I should credit to someone, because I've heard that be said before and I don't know who said it. And then the other thing I took away from what you said is that we need to streamline programs and services so that they're more intuitive, so folks know how to use them, which is their whole purpose in the first place. So thank you so much. Just another question as we start to continue to pivot that hopefully we can hear from a number of folks about is you have over 200 people on this chat, in this room who are in positions to change things, right? Systems, we often talk about systems like they're these things that people aren't in charge of. You have over 200 people who can make changes and or tweak things about how higher education is functioning in the state of Washington, how policy is made in the state of Washington. What do you suggest for them to do differently? What can they do to construct a more equitable, responsive higher education system? Do you have any suggestions for them?
I do. I have a suggestion. Before I get to my suggestion, though, I would like to, I wanted to really know, what does pave the way mean? What does it mean to pave the way? So I decided to look up the definition of pave the way. And so what it means is to make it easier for something to happen or for someone to do something. And I also thought it was really interesting, you know how the dictionary, and that's Webster's definition. And the dictionary most often, or I should say quite often, will have a sentence using that word as, you know, so you can see how it's used in a sentence. And so this sentence I thought was really, really interesting and particularly important to this conversation. So the sentence, that sample sentence that they used was, this discovery paves the way for development of effective new treatments. And I thought that that was particularly important to this particular conversation because I think as we go look back in history and we look at the origin of and I like the word opportunity gap also, when we go back and look at it, the origin of this idea that people of color, Black people, couldn't achieve was not based in a firm belief that Blacks or other people couldn't achieve. In fact, we know that because they passed laws that prevented Blacks from learning how to read. Laws were passed that prevented Blacks from becoming lawyers, from becoming doctors, pharmacists. So what that implies is that you know that we can. So you put these laws in place to keep us from doing it. However, what we see now is because of cultural conditioning, we see now we don't have to have the law, but we can still have the result in place. And so having this opportunity to speak to those who have the ability, or to those who play a role, have an obligation, and they also have this opportunity to change this institutional culture that we now have, where it went from, they didn't really believe that, but now we can see where some people actually believe it because we've been conditioned to believe it. So one of the things I would like to share about myself is that I have attended every single community and technical college in Pierce County. I've been to Bates, I've been to Clover Park, I've been to Pierce, you know, so, and I was having this conversation with someone else, and now I'm at TCC. And the thing that came up was, what was the difference? And what I can say is the difference, that what made a difference for me as far as attainment goes, and opportunities for change, is when I walked through the doors after I enrolled. I had no problem enrolling. I enrolled online. So I went and I actually enrolled, and I saw a pamphlet that was talking about scholarships, because I needed money to be able to, you know, I had enrolled, but now I need to pay for it, right? So I went through the pamphlet, and I was nervous because I was thinking, I will never get a scholarship. You know, what do I know? I haven't been to school in over 20 years. You know, so I was like, I'll never get a scholarship. So anyway, I got up the nerve to call and ask about the scholarship. And the scholarship coordinator, she said, you know what, meet me in front of the financial aid office and we can have a discussion about it. We had a discussion about the scholarship, and she said 4 words that were completely important to me. And the 4 words that she says was, I will help you. And that right away kind of started to melt away some of the fear and anxiety. And you know what? She actually followed through. She sat with me for 3 hours helping me fill out the scholarship application. She sat with me those 3 hours. She actually helped me write the essays. I hadn't written essays in 20 years, over 20 years. She helped me write the essays, she revised the essays, and she spent 3 hours. And that was the first barrier that was broken, you know? So I did get the scholarship. I attended my first couple of classes and I got A-, and that helped me. So that was a way that TCC invested in people who in turn invested time in me. And I think that has been completely important and transformational to me. And now I will be graduating from TCC this year. My hope is to get into POU, where, and it's just been important because, you know, even at that point, I was getting ready to attain another professional technical degree. But another layer that TCC added was helping me get an internship with the state board. And while at the state board, they actually counseled me, not just advised me, but they counseled me and talked about and showed me that there were other opportunities, other ways. I wasn't even thinking about transferring until I had this opportunity. So again, here we see where the school, if you invest in people who will in turn invest their time in students, it will make a big difference. And I was you could say poster child. I mean, I was single parent, African-American woman, low income, all these kinds of things. But the thing that made the difference to me was someone who took the time and they said, I will help you. And you know what? She didn't even look like me. And at that point, it didn't matter because the barriers started to come down. And that opportunity led from just being a student. I got an internship. That internship as a legislative intern led to other opportunities. Now I have been appointed by the Governor Inslee to the Workforce Education Investment Accountability and Oversight Board. And that all started with those 4 words, I will help you, by a woman who took 3 hours to help me fill out a scholarship application. So I think, and if there's anything that I can say that would convince those who are in power to do something, I would say to them, invest money to invest in people who will in turn invest time in students, and you will see many more amazing transformations.
Yeah. Absolutely, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Absolutely, I think a big takeaway for me is, yes, we need to invest in people, because people can be the difference in our students' success, certainly. And I think states like Washington State, California too, can make very different decisions about how we do that. We choose to invest in places that are not about student supports, and then we wonder why we see the sorts of outcomes that we see. So we only have a few more minutes left, and I want to make sure, because when we checked in on Monday, I know you all have phenomenal things to say. So I want to make sure we hear from Mustafa, Demia, Cynthia, and Ashley on this question as well. So just keep in mind, we have maybe about 5 or 6 minutes left before we pivot to Q&A. And so I want to hear from I think just the 4 of you who haven't shared yet. What would you suggest to these folks on the call who can make changes, they can do something different? What would you say to them? What should they do differently? I think Mustafa is unmuted.
Jump in here real quick, because I'm a transfer student, so I come from a community college where I knew everybody. If I needed help, I could just go into someone's office and just say, I need help on this, and people will invest time. To Diana's point, to invest time to help students. So when I transferred to UW, of course, when I got into the school, I was so excited because, students would always talk about UW, but it was a whole different experience. I needed help on my first day, and it was very difficult to get someone to help me. I went to the desk and say I wanted to speak with an advisor. They were like, advisors are not available this whole week. Maybe you could set an appointment for 2 weeks in time. I'm like, I need help, or else I will be not able to enroll, because it has to deal with financial aid and all of that. And there's a deadline. And with going to a 4-year school, it's bigger. And if you don't do one thing right, it's going to haunt you for the next quarter, the upcoming quarter, and all of that. So what can we do to help support students that way? Because of that, I decided to run for the Student Senate Vice Speaker, which is our legislative body in our student government, to see how best we can change some of the internal policies in UW to make sure that we uplift certain barriers, especially for students of color. And with this year, UW was able to uplift its requirements for students to take the SAT exams before they admit to UW. So that is one step to making sure that students of color have this access to being applied to UW and being admitted. Because when you look at the SAT, it creates a privilege for white students to have that extra time to study and all of that, compared to the students of color who have to get 2 jobs to pay for school, and they don't have the time to study as much as the white students do. So having those discussions with students, making sure that when decisions are being made, you have students on the table, because most of the time we hear that we are here for students, we work for students, but you cannot really work for students or represent them when you don't have them on the table. I know what I'm going through. I will be able to share my perspective to bring that to the table, rather than coming up with ideas that don't really reflect the values of students. So making sure that we create spaces for students like this to hear from them and see how best we can help them and meet their needs. I think that will help uplift the barriers that students currently face in higher education.
Yeah, what's this? I'm terrible at sayings, but nothing for us without us, I think I've heard. So certainly, for sure. Demia, I think I saw you unmute earlier.
Yeah, I've been trying to get in. I just want to start out by saying I was not in the right headset when I got on here, but I love being surrounded by Black excellence. Like I want to give everybody a round of applause, because you guys are just spitting image of just people of color doing their stuff. Like, just go ahead and do your stuff. And for me, I would say, for the people that are on this call, I would say to do with intent. So often you have people making these laws, making these bills, and they sit down and they think about it, and so many factors play into making one move, and they sooner forget to the people that's going to affect them, and the emotional side of it. And I would say, when you are sitting down, when you are handed this money, do with intent, because you need to remember that for people of color, it's not just a challenge of getting into college. It's a challenge of being a single mom. It's a challenge of not being able to provide every day, not knowing where your next meal is going to come from. I can vouch for this because my mom is so much like Natasha and Deanna, because she had to show me an example of what a life could be outside of growing up in the ghetto, growing up in the hood, where so often I was just shown violence, nothing else, just violence. And when my mom pushed me and she showed me it was a different way and a different path, she created that for me, no one else. And for me, I would say, remember those faces, remember our faces, remember the faces that you ever met from a person that needed someone's help but didn't have anyone to help them. Remember what are these things really going to do? Because you can have a goal, but the goal is not going to be achieved if the people and the method of how it is done is not being succeeded, then the goal would never be reached. So I would say, put people in charge that it's not just an affirmative action hire, it is an intent hire. It is people that really are going to care long run and say, yeah, I will help you no matter what. I will drop everything and I will help you through your path. And use the money that people give us, that people give the state board or whatever, to really continue the motion in the success of people of color, because we have so much to offer. We are not just struggling people. We are powerful people that have so much to bring to life. And I would say, just do with intent, and bring the emotional side back to um, everything, honestly, because so much in politics, it's not emotional no more. It's really just, get it passed and let things fly by the radar. And the rhetoric that we see nowadays is so hurtful and so harmful to someone out there. And I would say, just remember to do what remember what you came here to do. You came here to help people. You wanted to help and to see people succeed in life. And so that's what I would give the people that are watching this, a real message. And I would thank you guys for letting me be here, because I love to see this whole thing unfold.
Thank you. A reminder to move with intent. That's so important. Ashley, Cynthia, you two are going to bring us home.
Yeah, just a few quick things to speak on that. I think what everyone who is listening to us, what they can do is just as simple as ask the students, keep this conversation going. Just sharing this presentation and resources isn't enough. It's your part to keep the conversation going with everyone, continuously bring this up. And then to connect to like what you guys are talking about with your struggles within the school, it's true. I go to the office here, like the financial aid office, student business office, and I'm met with just such rudeness. And it's such as simple as like, how do I pay my bill for this quarter? Things like that. And I don't get that help. I don't get those words where they say like, I will help you. As a matter of fact, in my first year, it was another student who was 2 years ahead of me who helped me my first year. And that is not her responsibility as also a first generation student of color to help me while she's a full-time student with a full-time job. It was the school's responsibility, yet she put it in her position to help me through my first year. And if it wasn't for her, I would have dropped out and I would have stopped because I didn't know who to ask. I didn't know what questions to ask. And it's sad to say this, but even now that I'm a senior, working with the first generation students in their first year now at the same college, I hear the same exact things from them of what I said my first year. And it's sad to see that these systems still haven't improved and changed. And it's still another student who is helping these other students instead of the school and the university taking responsibility.
Thank you, Cynthia. Ashley, anything to add?
I would just like to add on, agreeing with Cynthia that this conversation needs to continue happening. And I think it's a great way for us to start off this year and just make us think about what can we do for our students this year. I want everyone to think about it on an individual, but also a community level, what way they can reallocate resources to BIPOC communities and BIPOC youth. Just think about it that way.
Thank you, Ashley. I think we're coming to the end of our time, so I'm going to ask one more question. We'll do like a quick go around for each of you, so get prepared. Just one word that you want the folks in this room to hold on to as they go about and do their jobs today, tomorrow, and in the next month and years. So we're going to go around to everyone. One word that you want folks to hang on to as they think about practices and policies and what changes they might want to make. I'm going to go in the order on my screen, and Ashley is up next. Deanna's next, just so you have a sense of who's coming up next. Ashley, you have one word for folks you want them to hold on to?
Probably the student, because the student is center in all of this. So.
Deanna, up next to Cynthia after Deanna. You're on mute. Yep.
Okay, I have a cluster of words. So I would just say that to walk away from this, I think it's really important to enable students to have the freedom to dream of higher education, to dream of what they can have in the future, which is something that was robbed from African Americans in particular and people of color, not even having the audacity to just dream of attaining higher education. So giving students the freedom to dream is what I would say.
Freedom, dream. Cynthia, what about you? One word that you want folks to take with them?
Just having empathy towards each other and understanding everyone's backgrounds and circumstances. Damia,
sorry.
Sorry, this is supposed to be quick. I would say, continue to, if the system lets you down, pave the way for yourself. Go ahead and do it yourself. Be an example for your community and uplift your community if other people let you down.
Awesome. I love it. Folks have taken one word and give us 25. I'm here for it. That's great. Natasha, what about you?
Advocate.
Okay. And last but not least, Mustafa, one word that you want folks to hold on to.
I'll say representation, because I believe our policy should be able to reflect what our students look like. Because with policies, there are a lot of implicit biases that we're not aware of. At the end of the day, end up affecting students. So representation matters as well.
Representation. I'm going to hand it back to Heather in just one second, but I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you all for allowing me to share this space with you. You all are fantastic. And something I believe Damia said earlier is I also wasn't in the headspace to be here earlier. And now I feel much better about the day and about the work that I have to do today. And I think for folks on this call, one thing that I hope folks would leave with is data don't tell the full story. As you have just heard today, there are stories underneath data that we all need to know about and keep close to us. And I think the word that I would say is urgency. These data are not new. And so as folks go and act in their day-to-day, just to keep in mind that these issues are urgent and they need urgent attention. So Heather, I will pass it back to you and thank you all again.
Well, I have absolutely nothing else to add. I think this was an incredible way to kick off our 2021 Pave the Way. So thank you. I would like to have a button that I can make a loud applause for all of our panelists. Dr. Christopher Nullum, thank you so much for moderating this very important conversation today. A shout out to Savannah Navarro-Cresse, who is the brain and inspiration behind this entire session. So congratulations, Savannah, for kicking off our Pave the Way session and for today. Please, if you have not signed up for our Pave the Way sessions, we will be doing these once a month throughout the year. So this conversation will continue. So sign up, go to our website. Our next one in February will be about returning adults. And we will be profiling some local areas that have been increasing their adult re-enrollment to pursue a post-secondary degree. So this conversation will continue, and we invite you all to continue it with us. So please join us for future Pave the Way sessions. Please reach out to us if you have follow-up questions or comments. We want to hear from you. And again, thank you all to our students and our moderator, Dr. Nellam. Take care.